In Chapter 25, we're going to, for our objectives, we're going to see what happens when weak liberal democracies fail to deal with the difficult problems of the 1920s and 1930s and the problematic peace after the Great War. We're also going to examine how World War II broke out and how it ended. And we're also going to raise moral questions about the nature of the war, particularly its status as a total war. Now, before we continue with the issue of fascism, and we're going to be focusing in this little section on fascism, what it is. We're going to look at the German and Italian varieties of fascism. We're also going to consider the question of whether Japan itself was fascist. One thing, though, we need to look at, though, is the importance of the economy. And the reason we need to do that is to understand why people were open to fascism. There's a tendency sometimes to look at Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany and say, wow, how could those people have been so stupid? How could those people have been so crazy? How could those people have been so immoral to embrace fascism, to embrace this authoritarian style of government? What were they thinking? And it's important for us to understand what they were thinking, to understand why people were open to these forms of government that to us are rather distasteful, to us that are rather problematic. So it's important, that's one thing I'm going to try and focus here on. Why would people embrace these authoritarian models? And I just want, as a reminder, I'm not saying that we should therefore like these models or that we should therefore think that they're acceptable. Rather, my point is we need to understand why people would do things that don't make sense to us or that seem evil to us. So one thing I want to focus on in particular is the importance of the economy. One thing that determined whether a country would become authoritarian, that is to adopt something like a fascist style of government, which we'll discuss what a fascist style of government is shortly, whether it would become authoritarian or remain open and democratic, was whether it owed money or not. Right? If a government owed a lot of money, and if it was a debtor country, it was more likely to move towards an authoritarian style of government. On the other hand, if a country was a creditor country, a country that was owed more money than it itself owed, right? It's a country that had loaned a lot of money, that hadn't borrowed a lot of money, that country was much more likely to stay democratic. So economics played an important part in whether a country became democratic or remained democratic, or whether a country embraced an authoritarian government, usually some sort of fascism. It's important for us to understand that authoritarian governments were in part a response to comparative property. Right? Again, this isn't to excuse fascism, this isn't to say fascism was okay, but it's important to understand why people might have been attracted to fascism. So then we need to ask ourselves, what is fascism? What do we mean when we use the term fascist? Oftentimes, because this term is connected with Nazis, this is used as kind of an insult. You hear someone say, well, that's fascist, or something like that. And it's important to note when we're using it in this class, we're not using it in an insulting term. We actually are trying to say something when we say the word fascist. So what do we mean by fascist? Well, first of all, a fascist fascism emphasize ultranationalism. Ultranationalism is basically very strong nationalism. But whereas a nationalist can kind of respect other people's countries, ultranationalists typically look down on other people's countries, right? So you can be a nationalist and say, hey, I just love my country, and I love my country, I'm willing to sacrifice for my country. An ultranationalist says that, but an ultranationalist also says, I think your country's pretty terrible, right? Ultranationalists tend to look down on other people's countries. So they're people who think that not only do they love their country, they think their country is the absolute best, and it's certainly much better than yours. Fascist governments also tend to be authoritarian and totalitarian. Authoritarian here means that they think that they can tell you what to do. An authoritarian government tells you what to do. And they're totalitarian in that they claim to be able to intervene widely in their citizens' lives. Right? So a government that is authoritarian and totalitarian can tell you what to do in basically every aspect of your life. For example, it's typical in the United States to say what two consenting adults do in their bedrooms is their own business. A fascist would disagree with that a lot. Fascists would say that that's a bad idea. And to give an example of how you can see these kind of concerns by fascists, in Nazi Germany, there was a law that prevented Jews and non-Jews from marrying. And in fact, not only were they forbidden from marrying, they were forbidden from having any kind of sexual contact. Similarly, German women who were not Jewish were rewarded if they had lots of children. So the government is willing to involve itself very closely in the sexual lives of its citizens. So that's something that tends to be more authoritarian. They're telling you, you can't have sex with this person, you can have sex with this person, and it's totalitarian because it's reaching very deeply into its people's lives. Now, the way this is justified, though, is the state says it must exercise this total control to bring social harmony and to bring justice. Right, it's to bring social harmony and justice. Right? We have to exert control in this way, and we have to exert a lot of control in order to bring social harmony and justice. Fascism also has socialist elements. Right? The basic idea here is that there's a belief that the government, as an authoritarian, totalitarian government that's supposed to bring social harmony and justice, should also exercise control over the economy. Right? So fascism can also be socialist. The government exercises lots of control over the economy. You have lots of state-run enterprises, or at least the government is able to come in and tell businesses what they can and can't do, using, again, this authoritarian power. So, right, so you had these socialist elements. And what's interesting is, and this is why Nazis could claim to be national socialists. Now, fascism is also very anti-communist. Remember that communism theoretically places its emphasis all on class. Everything's about social class. The thing that drives history is class conflict, right? And so in a sense, your first loyalty should be to your class, whereas nationalism says that your first loyalty should be towards your nation. Communism was therefore the enemy of fascism, because fascism is ultranationalist, right? They really emphasize your loyalty to your nation. Communism, because it emphasizes loyalty to your class, was therefore bad, and therefore was the arch enemy of fascism. Now, as we've said before in class, typically communists were often themselves nationalists, so this is a theoretical distinction which often didn't have too much of a basis in reality, but this is why the fascists were anti-communist, was because the theories were completely different. In addition, fascists usually had a mass party centered around a dynamic, charismatic leader. Right? You had a mass political party that was centered around this leader and would serve that leader. Now, we kind of saw that in chapter 24 with Gandhi, right? Gandhi was a charismatic figure, and the Indian National Congress served as his mass party, and Gandhi ordered this party to take part in acts of civil disobedience and boycotts and so forth. And he had a lot of power because a lot of people were following him. In this sense, there's that kind of comparison, right? Hitler was a charismatic leader. Many people looked up to him and were willing to follow him, and similar to Gandhi in that sense. What, of course, was different was that Hitler used violent means, whereas Gandhi did not. Right? These mass parties, unlike the Indian National Congress, would come and beat you up and possibly kill you. Moreover, another key difference has to do with this idea of a party state. Gandhi believed in democracy, and most of the people that we were dealing with in chapter 24, a lot of them also believed in democracy, that you had real elections. But fascists want to establish a single party state, a state that is dominated by the party and acts in accordance with that party, does what that party says. So it'd be somewhat like if the United States, instead of having several different parties to choose from, we only had one political party, and that political party, all the members of Congress and the president all came from that political party. That's essentially what a party state is, and fascism calls for such a state. Now, we usually connect Adolf Hitler with fascism, but the fact is that Hitler was not the first fascist. The first fascist was this man, Benito Mussolini. In the 1920s, right after World War I, Italy faced a really chaotic situation. There was a lot of economic problems in Italy, a lot of political unrest. And in that situation, a man named Benito Mussolini established his own mass party. And Benito Mussolini started off as a socialist, and he kept a lot of those ideas, but he added nationalism. And Mussolini took this mass party and marched on Rome in 1922. He had all these people in his mass party. Many of them were former veterans, so they were tough guys, right? They'd fought in World War I. They were people who knew how to use violence. And they got together and marched on Rome, the capital of Italy, in 1922. And the Italian government panicked. And in order to instead of calling in the army which they probably didn't trust to actually put down this mass march, they decided to try and bring Mussolini into the government by appointing him prime minister. So Mussolini, in his march on Rome in 1922, with his mass party, leads to him becoming prime minister, and he uses that position in this weak liberal democracy to seize complete power by 1924. And Mussolini is a fascist. He believes in extreme nationalism plus socialism. Right? He believes in this extreme socialism, state control of the economy, essentially. And he's also a fierce anti-communist. And one thing that's really important about this is that Mussolini is the guy who develops this fascist model. Right? We see here that this mass party, built on nationalism and socialism, has a lot of power. It attracts a lot of veterans who are tough guys and who are able to, they follow Mussolini, this charismatic leader, and they're able to basically take over the government in just a few years. And this is a model that other people are going to be watching and are going to try and imitate. Now, one person watching this model who thought that this was a good model was this man Adolf Hitler. He was a World War I veteran who had served with distinction in the trenches, had been a decorated soldier who by all accounts served bravely, and he was inspired by Mussolini to adopt this National Socialist model of fascism. And Adolf Hitler in particular wanted to restore Germany's national honor and glory after the humiliation of Versailles. You'll recall that the Versailles Treaty, which ended World War I, put all the blame on Germany. It said the war is all of Germany's fault, so Germany was humiliated. Germany had to pay a lot of money to the Allies in the form of reparations, and Germany was forced to maintain a very small army, and without the latest technology. And one thing and also of course Germany lost territory. That's how Poland was established, in part from German territory and in part from Russian territory. And Germany was actually also, we didn't talk about this previously, but they weren't allowed to have troops near France. They weren't allowed to station any of their small troops near France. So Adolf Hitler was himself able to start building a mass party like Mussolini around himself. He was a charismatic person. Especially he learned how to imitate Mussolini to become even more charismatic. And he was able to draw together a large number of veterans, again, people who knew how to use violence, with his combination of nationalism and socialism. And notice Mussolini tried in 1922, or he had his march on Rome. Mussolini had his march on Rome in 1922. Adolf Hitler would launch a coup attempt in 1923 to overthrow the German government, the liberal democracy that was then ruling Germany. Now, this coup failed, and Hitler was thrown in jail. And in jail, he wrote this book, Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. If we read Mein Kampf, if we look at Mein Kampf, we can get an idea of what Hitler believed. For one thing, of course, he had this belief in National Socialism, this idea that the government should control the economy for the good of the nation state. And he was an ultranationalist. He thought that his nation was the best nation, or in his words, he tended to talk about this group, the Aryan race. Germans were part of this pure Aryan race, the master race. Remember, it's better than other people. They were found in Germany, but also other members were found in Northern Europe. And the ideal type was this kind of blonde-haired, blue-eyed person. Now, the idea is that since they're the master race, it's not just their nation isn't just one nation among many. Their nation is the best nation, and therefore they should rule the world. Now, they had enemies, though. This master race had enemies. It had internal enemies in the form of Jews and unfit people. We'll talk more about these two groups and how they're targeted later on. It also had an external enemy, communism. And as you can kind of get an idea so far, because they're talking about race, there's some social Darwinism and eugenics ideas influencing the Nazis. So when they attacked communism, they connected it specifically to Slavic ethnic identity, to Russian identity. So they saw this, even communism, while it was bad enough, was in a sense connected to having bad biology. So you had these external enemy, the communists, who were Slavs. They were bad people, they were subhuman people, certainly not nearly as good as the master race. And it was necessary for the master race, because it was the best race, to destroy these subhumans, right? To destroy these unfit people, destroy these Jews, to destroy the communists, the Slavs, and take their land and their resources. Right? So we see echoes of social Darwinism here. Right? We see this kind of idea that we have a master race that's biologically superior to other races, and therefore, in accordance with the laws of evolution, can destroy those races. And of course, the Nazis, as we'll see, also believe in eugenics, in strengthening the nation by preventing the birth of unfit people, or else by killing them once they are born. Now, we often think of the Axis powers as being Germany, Italy, and Japan. And there was a tendency then, during the war, to kind of put the three of them together and to label them all fascist. And there's still a tendency to do that today. But it is kind of, I think, important to talk about that they weren't necessarily all fascists. Japan was very different from Italy and Germany, but it was also similar. And that's it's important, I think, for us to just look at that, to see the similarities and differences between these three countries that are going to form the Axis power. Now, Japan, in some ways, had a lot of similarities to these fascist countries. Japan had, during World War, in the 1930s and into World War II, there was a growing state control over industry in Japan. So you had this kind of growing authoritarianism. Japan was also certainly ultranationalist. But the Japanese believed that their Japanese race had a special role to play in leading Asia. So again, this kind of idea that not only is our nation good, but it's better than all the other ones. So there's some similarity there. But there are some differences. There is no Nazi party in Japan. There's no mass party like Nazis in Japan. There's no mass party like Mussolini's mass party. They don't have that. Moreover, Japan also does not have a dynamic, charismatic leader. Adolf Hitler and Mussolini were famous for giving really powerful speeches and for being almost hypnotic in the way that they could speak and the way that they could move crowds. And if you watch a movie of them giving speeches, the gesticulations they make, their movements are just really powerful, and they give the feeling of dynamism, of power, of energy. As you can see from this picture, Emperor Hirohito, the ruler of Japan, doesn't have that same energy. Most Japanese people never heard him talk. He would occasionally give speeches, but I don't believe he ever appeared on the radio in Japan, whereas Adolf Hitler and Mussolini made ample use of the radio. The first time that the Emperor Hirohito really talks on the radio is during the surrender, when he announces his surrender to the Allies. And in that case, he doesn't talk live, he actually makes a recording. They make several recordings to see which one is the best, right? Because he's kind of this godlike emperor who's distant from us. So it's a little different there in Japan than it is in Germany and Italy. What's also interesting is that whereas Hitler actually gained control of the government and then took control of the army, right? Hitler gains control of the government and then uses the government's army. In Japan, we have something else going on. In Japan, the civilian government is very weak and can't control the military. The Japanese government is basically kind of dragged into this war by the military. So it's a little different. Hitler certainly kept control of the military, and he did so very successfully. The emperor and the civilian rulers of Japan were never able to control the military until the very end, when they did finally force the military to allow the surrender to the Allies. Alright, so in this section we have looked at what fascism is. We're going to have one more video, which is due to make up for Friday, which will be about the rise of the Nazis to power.